Welcome to the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit. These weekly podcasts feature expository messages delivered to edify the soul. Now let's join Pastor Dave as he presents this week's message. You take your Bible and turn with me to the book of Esther. I'm going to take a break today from our what I began last week, the Spirit and the Bride series. And we're going to come over here to Esther for Father's Day and take a look at Mordecai. It's a great example of a godly man in a godless generation, similar to what we find ourselves in today as men. So this will be for fathers, but moreover for men in general. I think all of these things apply. So Esther, find the book of Psalms and go to the left. And Psalms, Job, and then you'll hit Esther. Esther chapter 2 will begin Mordecai's story. Of course, we know the story of Esther. Chapter 1, we get to look inside the tinkerings of the Persian court. A drunk king is upset with his wife, who probably is acting in the most moral manner of all the people in the court. She's not going to display herself for a bunch of drunk courtiers and a drunk king. And so all the men get together and decide, well, we got to get rid of Vashti. She's a problem. And they send out letters to all the provinces and say, hey, send in your girls for a beauty contest. And of course, that is non-negotiable. All the eligible maidens went. You couldn't opt out. There was no program for that. And so Esther goes. We find out about Esther and about Mordecai here in chapter 2. One of the things that you know about the book of Esther is that the name of the Lord is never mentioned in the book of Esther. As a matter of fact, it's funny that we have all of these characters and there's not even a theophoric name in the book of Esther. So God's name appears nowhere, not even in personal names. He's not mentioned. However, his hand is seen throughout the book and his providence. And of course, that's the point, that men think they're in charge, but really the one in charge is the Lord. It's one of the points of the book. Mordecai, we look there in chapter 2, verse 1. We'll read just a couple of verses here. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, under the custody of Haggai, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. Let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. Now, ladies, this is for you as well. These things cross the aisle, We're just going to talk about being compassionate, being faithful, and being courageous. So we're here in Shushan, the palace, and we have these folks that are mentioned here beginning in verse 5, Mordecai and Esther. Mordecai must have been a name that was given to him while he was in captivity. It's not a Hebrew name. It's actually a name that refers to one of the gods of that area, Marduk. Mordecai is a theophoric name, but in that way, not in the way that the Jews would have used it. So it's a name of one of their gods. And of course, Esther is also as well, but we have her Hebrew name. Her Hebrew name here means gazelle, and she must have been a lovely young lady, had to have the name Gazelle. But they gave her the name of Esther, which also is a theophoric name for the god Ishtar. So these have been renamed in the story, again, sort of putting an emphasis on the fact that we don't have the Lord mentioned here at all, not even in the names of the folks here. Now you'll notice that we're told about this fellow Mordecai. He comes from a lineage that we're familiar with, Kish. Kish is the father of Saul. So the heritage of Kish comes over through this man Mordecai. He's a Benjamite. He's living in Shushan, which is the royal city. It is the palace city, the throne city of the Persian Empire. And you'll see there that he'd been carried away, and he's bringing up this young lady that has been called Esther, his uncle's daughter. So this is his cousin that he's raising. And her mom and dad had passed away, so he took her for his own daughter. The very first thing that we know about this man, besides his heritage, besides the fact where he lives, what his name is, where he's from, how he got there, all of that is given to us. But the most important thing we find out about this man is that he's compassionate. You notice the very first thing it says there is that her mom and dad were dead, so he took her for his own daughter. We should celebrate men who show tenderness to those who have great need. And this woman had great need. She had nobody to care for her as a child, so he raises her. He takes this orphan girl into his own home. Now, yes, she's related to him as in the sense of being a cousin, but still, his impulse here is to not let her suffer, but he brings her into his house. We all know men like this. We've seen them. They've adopted, in a sense. We use that word loosely maybe because it's not a formal adoption, but they adopt spiritually, and in love they adopt people that are not their own, children that are not their own. And so these kind of men are men that we need to celebrate on Father's Day. I think this is a part of the mind of Christ. For us as Christians, the name of Jesus should be celebrated amongst men who act in this way, who imitate their Lord by showing tenderness to those who have no help. Because we know that our God is a helper. He is good and does good. And so men who do good and who help others in this way show us a reflection of our Savior. He also shows discretion. You'll notice, if you'll just skip down there in chapter 2, look at verse 10. Verse 8 and verse 9 tell us about Esther and her appearance on the scene in the house of the women and how she became the preferred girl in the house. And then in verse 10, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. This shows us something about Esther, number one. And number two, it tells us something about Mordecai. And I can't pass up the opportunity to tell you, Esther is quite a young lady, because you know what she does? She doesn't try to make up her mind herself. She leans on the instruction of the man that raised her. He said, don't tell anybody who you are, that you're a Jewess. And so she decided that that was a good policy. She would be obedient to Mordecai. Now, she's grown enough to make her own decision. She's off into the palace. She's in the house of the women. So she could decide what she wants to decide. But what she decides to do is to be obedient to the man that raised her. That's impressive. That's very impressive. She shows great discretion here, and so does Mordecai, because he knows that her revealing her heritage would only cause her difficulty. If she showed that she was a Jew, that she was a Jewess, that would just cause trouble because, well, it still would cause trouble. The Jews are still today, they are still persecuted simply for being a part of that group. Now, we might want to think that we're, more advanced than all of that and more tenderhearted towards different groups, but we're really not. You look around the world today, especially in the United States, and you'll see how the Jews are being disparaged every day, all the time. And so when Mordecai says, you know what, just keep that to yourself, I think he's doing something that's very important here. Matthew Henry said, all truths are not to be spoken at all times, though an untruth is not to be spoken at any time. A little gem there from Dr. Henry. It's so true. You don't have to tell everything you know. And so the discretion of Mordecai, Esther adopts and displays that herself. And then it's in verse 11, if you just keep on going there, Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Isn't that tender? Isn't that gorgeous? He cared for her so much. He loved her so much. Even though she's not his daughter, she's adopted by him, brought into his house, raised by him. He is so concerned about her that just like a dad would do, every day he just, happens to find his way by the house of the women, right? He's going to the store, but the store's over there and the house of women's over there, so he takes the long route to go to the store, just so he could go by and maybe hear something. And no doubt, of course, Mordecai is connected. He probably knew somebody that knew somebody, and he's always whispering, so how's she doing? Is it okay? What's going to happen next? Where is she in the process? So he's all the time checking to see, because, she's not going to come out. They're not going to let her come out. Once in, she's in for life. I mean, that was a life sentence to go there. She's not coming out. And so Mordecai is going by, and he's getting the information that he can from the folks that he can. He's saying, "What? Tell me what's going on." This is a father's impulse, isn't it? You want to raise them to let them go, and you want them to prosper and have their own place and make their own money and be their own people and be able to handle the world. That's where I come from as a father. I want my boys to be able to handle the world. I want them to be able to do what they need to do, to be able to handle their own money, to make their own money, to have their own place. But I'm still, there's still that thing inside me that says, how are they doing? I want it to go well for them. And so that's what's going on in Mordecai's heart. This is, again, that compassionate nature of fathers. And as I said at the beginning, I think this reflects the mind of Christ. This is something that the believer would be about. They would be concerned. And even though it's not said here, I guarantee you that when Mordecai got back home after he made his round trip, just happened to go by the women's house, he was praying. He was praying for Esther, for Hadassah. He's asking the Lord to take care of her. This is the compassionate nature of fathers. This is the compassionate nature of men who are in Christ. Now there are, 1, 2, 3. We're going to hit 3 chapters in a row here. You ready? First thing is about this man. Not only is he compassionate, he shows tenderness, he shows discretion, and he shows care for this young lady in all the ways that we already described here in chapter 2. But this man is also faithful to his king. And you'll notice here in chapter 2, there in verses 21 and 22, Mordecai is the king's gatekeeper. He sits in the king's gate. This is a high position in the Persian government. To be the keeper of the gate means that you're the one responsible for everybody coming in and going out of that palace. You oversee every person that transfers between those places. So the palace is its own little city, and everything outside of that is the city. But inside the palace, it's its own little place. And so you've got to have somebody trustworthy there at that gate to make sure that the right people are coming in at the right time. And so that's Mordecai's position there in the government. Those days while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it to Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. So he's a faithful man. He's doing his job. And you know what? He could have just ignored the whole thing. Why? Well, Esther now is living in the palace with the king, and maybe he didn't like this king because he had taken his stepdaughter to be his wife. Maybe he didn't like that. There could have been lots of reasons why he didn't like this king. But he had a position, he had a job to do, and you know what he did? He was faithful to do it. And as he heard those men talking, coming through the gate, yes, he could certify them to come into the palace because they worked there. But what he overheard should not be in the palace. So he told Esther And Esther certified it to the king in Mordecai's name, and it was searched out. And of course, if you read verses 23, inquisition was made about the matter, and they found it was to be true. And so this faithfulness is pointed out of this man, Mordecai. Are you faithful? Maybe not to your king. We don't have kings and queens like they did, but are you faithful to your job, to your boss, to what you're responsible for? Are you a faithful employee? This man points that out to us. But not only was he faithful to his employee, to his king, in that way, he was also faithful to God. Notice verse 1 through 4 there in chapter 3. After these things did the king promote Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set him above the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgress thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, that he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. This is why, number one, he doesn't bow before Haman, because he's a Jew. He's not going to reverence somebody other than God. The other thing is that Haman, you'll notice the description of Haman there in verse 1, it says he's an Agagite. He's a descendant of the Amalekites. And not only a descendant of the Amalekites, but a descendant of the royal line of the Amalekites, because the throne name for the Amalekites was Agag. And you'll find Agags going all the way back to Numbers, all the way up to David's time when Saul was supposed to kill all the Amalekites and Agag, their king, but he didn't. And so they still continue, and now we have here in the palace in Shushan an Agagite, that is a royal descendant of the Amalekites, now second only to the king of Persia. Mordecai is not going to bow before him simply because he's not going to worship any other than God alone, and because he's an Agagite and he's an enemy of Israel. Has always been, will always be. So Mordecai is not going to have any part of him. So he's faithful. And this would be hard to do, wouldn't it? He's the keeper of the gate. And so people are coming and going all the time. But everybody wants you now to worship Haman. No, I'm not going to do that. Everybody wants you to bow down to the Agagite. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stand for what God has said. So he is faithful to his king, and he is faithful to God. This would be very difficult to do. Number one, being faithful to the king, because no doubt he knew Bigthan and Teresh. He knew these men. He worked with them. And yet, they're going to try to kill the king. So he has to juggle now. He has to judge. Am I going to be faithful to the king, or am I going to be faithful to my friendships? Which one's more important? And then here comes Haman, second now to the king, and everybody's told to bow before him. I'm not going to do that. Am I going to be faithful to God, or am I going to be faithful to this command which is unjust? So he has to now decide. But this man decides the hard things. He has a heart that is going to be faithful to his sovereign and is going to be faithful to his God. We know how things go here in the story. Not well. Haman is told that Mordecai doesn't bow before him, and of course he just swells up with anger, decides, well, it would be petty to just punish one man. How about if he punished all the Jews? Because he's an Agagite. Why not punish all the Jews? So we get the writ that goes out on a certain day. They cast the lots, they find the day, they find the month, they do the thing, they get the ring, they stamp it, can't be changed, it's going to happen now. And then in chapter 4, Mordecai, verse 1, perceived all that was done. Mordecai rent his clothes, put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. He comes to be a man of prayer, and he prays at the right time. This decree is gone out, and now something has to be done. And there's only one person that can do it, and that's God. And so he tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth, puts on ashes. He goes out into the street, and he begins to lament and to wail and to cry out to God It doesn't matter now who knows that he's a Jew. He's making it very plain. And it came even before the king's gate, and none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. But he's hoping that somebody inside the palace would see him and say, what's wrong with Mordecai? And guess what? Nobody paid a lick of attention except for one, Esther. She wanted to know what's the matter with him. So Esther and her maids came and told Esther. Esther wants to find out. She sends out there in verse 4, she sends out raiment to Mordecai to take away his sackcloth. She doesn't want the king to see that, but he refuses because he's a man of principle. This kind of man, not only is he compassionate, tenderhearted, shows discretion, cares for those that he loves, but he's also faithful. He's faithful to his sovereign, he's faithful to his God, and he's a man of prayer, and he knows when to pray. But the next thing, and the final thing I'd like to bring out about Mordecai in our study today, is that he's courageous. I want you to notice verse 8 in chapter 4. Esther sends out a trusted friend, Hattach. He's the guy who waits upon her from the king. She's queen now. She has this attachment who does whatever she says. She tells Hattach, she says, go forth, find out what's going on with Mordecai. There in verse 6. Verse 7. So Mordecai tells him everything that had happened about the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. Verse 8. He also gave him a copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it to Esther, to declare it to her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, to make request before him for her people. Now, you'll notice that he does not shrink away from the challenge that he's been given. Yes, he has gone to the Lord in prayer, but he still is a man of action, and so he has a plan. He stood firm in the face of this kind of threat, and he told Esther, you're the queen, but here's what you're going to do. Okay, so Dad is speaking now. Even though she's the queen of the country, Dad speaks. Mordecai speaks to her, and he says, here's what you're going to do. You're going to take this, you're going to go in before the king, and you're going to talk to him and talk some sense into him. That's his plan, and it's a good plan. He knows exactly what she should do. And can't you just hear Esther hearing this report back? He wants me to go into the king and say that? Yeah, and he's back, and you could just see Mordecai back there doing this, right, with his finger. This is what you're going to do, young lady. He's got it figured out. This is a guy who doesn't shrink from the challenge of his time. And men, we always face a challenge in our time. It's a challenge to be faithful. It's a challenge to be prayerful. And it's a challenge to stand up and to do what's right. And he knew the only thing that he could do was to speak to the woman that he had raised, whom God had placed in that palace, so that she could speak to the king's ear. Verse 13, Mordecai commanded her. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, and he said, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether hold thy peace at this time, then there shall enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? One of the finest passages in the Old Testament, probably the one that we all know the best, is this passage here in chapter 4. So he speaks truth to the queen, who seems to have become very comfortable in her position as queen. She needed somebody to shake her up a little bit, and the one to do that was Mordecai. So he doesn't shrink from the challenge of his time, and he speaks truth to the queen. You will not escape. Notice that there in verse 13. Don't think that you will escape. You won't. You're Jewish. They'll find that out. And then verse 14, he says, if you altogether hold your peace at this time, let's just, deliverance is going to come from someplace else. But in other words, don't you want to be a part of this? Don't you want to be a part of this deliverance? The Jews have interpreted this over the years as the place where the Lord is mentioned. The word there, from another place, is the word is makom in Hebrew, and they will often use that as a replacement for God's name. When they don't want to say the name of the Lord, they'll say makom instead. This comes right out of Esther's story. Don't hold your peace at this time. And then that last piece that he says to her, you don't know. Who knows, he says, whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. I guarantee you, Mordecai knew. This is just tongue in cheek. This is rhetoric here. He knew exactly. He knew that God had put her in that place. He knew that she had won out of the thousands of women that had come to the palace to compete in that contest. The Lord had laid his hand on her and put her on that throne. He knew. This is why you're there, to save us. He knew. So when he says, who knows whether or not you're come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Mordecai did. Dads, it's okay for us to be, and men, it's okay for us to be confident. She needed confidence. She needed a man to say to her, do this. She needed her dad to say to her, do this. She needed somebody to stand behind her and say, I'm with you in this. And this is what you need to do. Even as an adult, sometimes our children need a dad and need a mom to say the truth, to say the hard thing, and not to shrink from the challenge. These, I think, are the lessons of Mordecai. Compassionate man, a faithful man, and a courageous man, not afraid to say the truth.
Jesus will meet you.
Thanks for listening to this week's message. Please join us again next time for another installment of the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit.